Good morning, everyone. You're all very welcome. My name is Leo. I work for the National Youth Council. I'm involved with the Global Youth Work and Development Education team. And this week, it's all about One World Week for us. And it's all about that kind of, I suppose it's to call it a topic, to call it a theme. When we talk about power, power is massive. Power is about everything about being a human being. And even when we talk about our own breakfast, power can play a very important part of that as well. So very much this morning is about unpacking this hidden power of our breakfast and starting to start connecting some of the global aspects, maybe some of the global connections that we all have when we sit down in our morning and we get out our porridge, or sometimes on a Friday we might, like Peter said, dip into the chocolates and just go for it. So very much there's so many connections and such a massive global aspect when we talk about food, when we talk about power. And this morning we are joined by an amazing group of almost experts, I suppose we'll call them, when it comes to food, when it comes to understanding this global connections that we have within our food. So to kick it off this morning, and our MC for this morning, we have a wonderful young person by the name of Sophie Healy-Thow, who is a youth activist who promotes food security and gender equality. She is a lead group member of the Scaling Up Nutrition movement and serves on the board of the leading international charity ActionAid UK. She is a regular speaker and panelist at international conferences and events. Sophie is one of 10 women leaders featured in the Disney book Choose to Matter by ESPN presenter Julie Foundy, who encourages young women to find the leader within. In 2014, she was named by Time magazine as one of the most influential young people. Sophie studies international development and food policy at University College Cork. So no better person to kind of lead this conversation this morning and to get us to start thinking and seeing the global connections. And now I know most of you have your cameras off, but very much this morning, we don't want this to be a presentation. We want this to be a conversation where we can all contribute. So Sophie would ask me to, if people want to use the chat to ask throughout, please do. Or if at any stage you want to unmute yourself and turn on your camera to ask a question, we encourage it and we hope to see it. So Sophie, you're very welcome this morning and we look forward to what you have for us.
Thank you very much, Leo. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our panel discussion today. Although it's called a panel discussion, we'd really like it to be as interactive as possible. Young people are the future, we're the future leaders. So to be part of this conversation with people like Peter, Lucy and Rachel, who've been working in the field for quite a while and working in this area, to have this conversation with them, I think is really important. So please, you can raise your hand, you can put a question in the chat box. If you feel comfortable speaking out and turning on your camera, please do so. Let's make this as interactive as possible so we don't all suffer from Zoom fatigue this morning. So food is why we're all here, but it's really why we all exist in a way. It sustains life, it spreads joy, it brings us together, it's brought us together this morning. But if we are to feed 10 billion people within planetary boundaries, the way the world consumes food needs to change. So every stakeholder in the food value chain, from farmers to producers, retailers to civil society, to you as a consumer or an activist, has a pivotal role to play to create healthier, more equitable and more sustainable food systems. And it's obvious with the Sustainable Development Goals up in less than 10 years, the need to accelerate action is extremely, extremely clear. So I'm really happy to introduce our three panelists this morning. We have Peter Gaynor, who is the Executive Director of Fairtrade Ireland, where he has worked for the last 22 years. I'm 23, so you've been doing this work for nearly as long as I've been alive. That's pretty cool. Peter has also had a number of roles with fair trade work internationally, including being on the board of Fair Trade International twice, and also leading on fair trade's workers' rights for over a decade. Very welcome to you this morning, Peter. We also have Lucy Geraty, who is Fair Trade Ireland's project and support coordinator. She has been with Fair Trade for almost 2 years now, and works on community projects such as fair trade schools, towns, colleges, workplaces, and festivals. She also coordinates Fair Trade Fortnight, which runs during the last week in February and the first week in March every year. Prior to joining the Fair Trade team, Lucy studied in UCD and the University of Oslo, where she developed a keen interest in sustainability and social justice and equality. Good morning, Lucy. Thank you for joining us. We also have Rachel Nee Kelleher, who is the head of international advocacy at Concern Worldwide. She works with a small team of advocates in Ireland, the UK, the US, and with colleagues working in Concern's 24 country programs. Concern is committed to addressing hunger and extreme poverty. But prior to returning to Concern in 2018, she worked with Trócaire as a humanitarian policy advisor after returning to Ireland after 16 years working with Concern and Save the Children in a variety of countries and contexts, covering community development and youth engagement and humanitarian work. Rachel, you've been a vegetarian from the age of 17, so back when being vegetarian wasn't really like an Instagrammable thing to be, so that's pretty cool. You're interested in what we eat, the assumptions and choices we make about food, and how we need to think about food in order to acknowledge and act on the growing levels of global hunger, food insecurity and malnutrition, and the centrality of food and conflict and displacement around the world. Very warm welcome to you, Rachel, this morning. Thank you for being here. So I think we are in really good hands in terms of the people who are leading the change within the food system in Ireland. But I've known about fair trade and Concern since I was really little. They're household names. So I'd be really interested to hear from both of you about who exactly is fair trade, who exactly is Concern, what made you want to work for these organizations and be part of something so big, but can create really local and lasting changes. So tell us who you are. Fair Trade, do you want to start?
Peter, do you want me to go? Or? Yeah, so Fair Trade, we're basically a not-for-profit organization. We're an alternative approach to trade. So what we do is, I think a lot of people hear the word fair trade and they think, oh, the farmer gets a fair price, and that's kind of all that we're about. But when you break it down, it's a lot more than that. So when you buy something with a fair trade mark, it has, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the logo. It's kind of a little man with his hand up. I think that's really important because it's kind of very much about empowerment and empowering people. So when you buy something with that mark, it means that a farmer is getting a fair trade minimum price, which is the minimum price for sustainable production for that product in that region. They're also getting a fair trade premium, which means that goes to a communal fund where a cooperative or a kind of farmer organization will choose how that money is going to be invested best to benefit that community. So we're not just about ethics, we're also about sustainability in terms of economic growth, but also sustainable production, which I think is really important, and something that sets us apart from other certification marks where they might just pick climate action or just paying people slightly more.
And Rachel.
Thanks, and good morning, everyone. Thanks, Sophie. So most people will know Concern. Concern has been around for 50 years. And currently, like you said, we're in 24 countries. The work of Concern covers everything from looking at agricultural production, looking at how communities can feed themselves, the type of challenges that people are facing, right through to looking at the treatment of malnutrition. And perhaps Concern is probably more well known for our work in crisis countries, but our focus is on the extreme poor and looking at the factors that keep people in poverty, the factors that really, prevent people from being able to flourish, and food is really at the heart of that. So whether it's in the informal settlements in somewhere like Port-au-Prince in Haiti, or whether it's in very rural, arid, climate-affected areas of Central Africa Republic, or it's in the heart of difficult conflicts in Syria, for example. Food is what sustains people, but also food is also something that creates conflict. And so we look at all aspects of how food, nutrition, agriculture, livelihoods can be supported in a positive way and in a really important way to try and help people to thrive. Thanks.
I think that's really interesting. And I think what you've both touched on, it's really broad, and it just showcases how broad food actually is and what it means to different people, whether it be a source of conflict or a place of fairness and fair trade and governance. And when we talk about food, we talk about a global food system, but there are individual food systems depending on the nation or the locality. But what is a food system? What does that actually mean? I suppose that's a broad question, but it's difficult to understand, I think. Could you give us an insight into what exactly a food system is and how it works? And I think that'd be a nice way to start today off.
Do you want to go, Lucy, or shall I? Okay, so thanks again. And maybe if we, I think the only way that we can think about the world is from where we're sitting. So if we're all having our breakfast, if we look at what we have in front of us, then that's a food system. Where did it come from? How did we get it? How was it produced? And all the parts that, all the different elements to bringing it to our table. And perhaps the perspective of fair trade is really important, because it's who gained and who lost in that process. What was the benefit and who reaped the benefit when in that food process. And then all the other factors, which is where I think Concern looks at, is what are the vulnerabilities of that system. So, many of you will know that the Horn of Africa is really under pressure because of locusts at the moment. So there's locust invasions. They've been seasonal over the last year or so. So it means that the crop cycle has been really badly affected by locusts coming, eating everything, but then planting their eggs. So when the next harvest cycle comes, they're off again. And so that's the vulnerability of a system, because then people's livelihoods are just absolutely wiped out. Then how do they eat? Then what happens to food prices? Food prices will go up because there's less available, and so on and so on. And then the question comes back to, well, who loses the most? And it's the people who were struggling to pay for their food in the first place. But I think if we come back to where we are and looking at what's in front of us, and then maybe thinking about all the steps in that process, and then we get a good sense of how, what the equality in the system is and where the vulnerabilities in the systems are. And that I think that then helps us to think very consciously about how it all fits together. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I'm curious, because last year Concern's health and nutrition programs reached 9.9 million people suffering from hunger and malnutrition, and fair trade has still had to exist in our modern world to ensure that farmers and people have better prices, decent working conditions, and fair terms for workers in the global south. So Peter, you've been working in this system for 22 years. What's gone wrong? Why does fair trade still have to exist? Why do people like you have to be so dedicated to the work you do? What's gone wrong?
Or maybe to come back to the previous question again, what is a food chain? A food chain can be something very local. It can be between fields up the road. I live in Tipperary. There's food produced locally here, and people consume it locally. But fair trade was set up to promote justice and trade between people in wealthy countries like Ireland and people in developing countries, based on the premise that tens of millions of people are poor not because they don't work hard, they don't get out of bed, but because they get a tiny fraction of the value of the goods that we buy from them. So looking at power and food, power, we can dissect or look at the word power from all kinds of perspectives. There's economic power, there's social power, there's good power, there's abusive power. There's power that's necessary for change to happen, and there's power that blocks change. So there's all kinds of power operating in food supply chains. The one at no expense, Sophie, we created this high-tech vision of the hourglass supply chain. I don't know if that's visible to anyone there. So if you look at the top and the bottom of it, what's going wrong in food chains? The dominance of a very small number. If you look at the middle, the suppliers and the retailers all over the world tend to dominate the commodities that fair trade works in. There's usually about 5 or 6 in coffee or cocoa or bananas. At the top of the production end, there are millions of cocoa, coffee, and banana farmers. And at the consumption end, where we're doing the buying, there's tens of millions of consumers and citizens. But the reality is the people with the economic power are the people in the middle, the suppliers in the banana trade or the coffee trade, the big brands, and then the retailers who make all the decisions about the products we get and the price that gets paid and the prices we pay. Now that's the classic view of the market, and what fair trade is saying is that we really would like to level out this relationship so that we have a direct relationship between the producers and the citizens and the consumers, and to bring more power into this relationship. And that's what we do. So we work with very small coffee farmers, we work with workers on banana plantations, cocoa farmers. But just in terms of my breakfast, because I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour, this is a little way to go chocolate that's grown, the cocoa that is grown in Ghana. That was released about a month ago. I'll come back to cocoa in more detail, hopefully, in a minute. This is a banana that comes from the other side of the Atlantic. It's very ready to eat. I meant to eat it before we started, but I didn't get a chance. So this one, this is an organic fair trade banana. They don't look like this when you buy them, but if you don't eat them quick enough, like every other banana, it can go, it's perfect, but it's got a bit blotchy. That comes from the Dominican Republic. And we'll go back to the Dominican Republic. Someone mentioned Haiti earlier, so Haiti and the Dominican Republic are on the same island. And this is a packet of coffee that comes from Latin America, probably Brazil, Colombia, and Nicaragua, probably the origins in this from Bewley's, which is a well-known Irish coffee company that went to 100% fair trade there a couple of years ago. So what we're trying to do with coffee farmers and cocoa farmers is to have a direct relationship with them. They co-own the fair trade system. So they're on the boards, they're on all of the proper committees about pricing. They own it and they help to control the prices that get set. So that takes away the dominance of power by the vested interests that have been around for decades and not hundreds of years. So what's gone wrong? What's gone wrong is that history was very brutal, as we know, in colonial periods. And we haven't really redressed the imbalance in Europe and in other wealthy countries of the legacy issues in places like Africa. There are a couple of million cocoa farmers in Ghana and in the Ivory Coast, and they're living on half the World Bank extreme poverty level. So that's about 90 cents a day. Now, why do we in Ireland? Do we think about that? Do Irish people think about it? Does the Irish government think about it? We don't really think about it. We think a bit about coffee and we think a bit about bananas, but we indulge our treats with cocoa and chocolate, and we don't know enough about what goes on behind it. And it's because we haven't dealt with the legacy issues of things like colonialism. It is probably to do with Black lives not mattering as much as white lives. But we're beginning to recognise in cocoa, we haven't travelled as far with cocoa as we have with coffee or bananas. If you look at the banana, which comes from, where are we from? So this comes from the Dominican Republic. That's on an island called Hispaniola, which is shared with Haiti, and that's where Columbus landed on his way out from Europe to North America. So one of the first things that happened in Hispaniola when the Spanish arrived there was they set up sugar plantations. And where they got the labor for the sugar plantations was from West Africa. So this isn't just theoretical stuff about European colonialism and the relationship we had with Africa. The production of commodities historically was based on slave labor. And that's what allowed us to harvest the wealth of developing countries by exploiting things like slave labor. And if you look at the moment in the Dominican Republic, even though fair trade is there, it's still really difficult to look after the migrant laborers from Haiti, who are often don't have an identity, they don't have a pass card. So if they, when they work in the banana industry in the Dominican Republic, it's difficult for them to assert their rights. I think Leo mentioned earlier that NYCI was looking at, we'll be talking to people about migrants in Ireland. One thing that I was really struck about, I was in the Dominican Republic a couple of years ago, was that at that time, the Dominican government had given a pass card to Haitian migrants so that they had some rights. But that was negotiated through fair trade. But if you look at what we're doing to migrants in Ireland, people in the Dominican Republic, and it's not a very easy place to live for an awful lot of people, but they were giving people the right to citizenship or a form of citizenship, and they weren't putting people in direct provision centres. So this thing about it's not just north and south or east and west. It's to do with how we treat people everywhere and how we treat people now. So power. I just want to focus a little, or maybe I should stop. I'll stop, Sophie, because I could just keep talking for the rest of the session, which probably isn't what you want. But come back to me.
Okay. I think what's really struck me about what you've just said is, first of all, the power and the justice element, not just about being a consumer, but also the producers, but also what you've mentioned about food has always been political. It has always been about politics. There's so much power in food and who controls food. That's really fascinating, but also really quite scary. I mean, I think it was only in 2018, the UN actually put in a I can't think of the proper term, but basically said that it is criminal to use food as a weapon of war. And I think that was only in 2018. So I'm really interested, Rachel, what does concern do in terms of getting to the root of how food is being used as a weapon in the programs and countries that you work in, but also locally? I'm sure there's local power dynamics and politics as well. So I'm really interested to hear from your side of things how it works.
Thanks, Sophie, and thanks, Peter. I could listen to you all day, actually, so we probably won't. We'll have so little time in an hour. So it's a huge question. So the resolution that you're referring to is resolution 2417 that was passed in 2018. And it is looking at food being used as a weapon of war, but also conflict-induced hunger. So looking at where hunger levels increase because of the conflict that's around it and the dynamics that are at play. And I suppose, I mean, I don't know if many of the people on the call will remember Darfur in the 2000s, and the learning from then, and obviously not just that conflict, but many others, but the dynamics that emerged, and again, they weren't new, but people started to talk about them, and people started to say this really is just not right, where people were prevented from harvesting their crops, but they weren't given any food. So people were taken away from the land and again, you know, not just in the Darfur situation, but just as one example. So it's one way of how do you control people in war? You prevent them from being able to harvest their land. You prevent them from being able to feed themselves and their family. And then in a conflict, it's often very difficult for people to access food from other sources. And you know, when you hear about humanitarian work and humanitarian response, that's where the work of concern is really, really essential in conflicts, because it's being able to negotiate the access to people who just need food. And particularly it's a chain of events. So people don't have food, but also if they don't have food, they don't have water. If they don't have water, they can't have good health care. If children don't have good health care, then they start to get sick, they get diarrhea, they get, you know, different diseases. And then you're looking at a situation of malnutrition. When children, particularly babies, suffer from malnutrition, then they start to die. And so it becomes, that's the cycle that we see over and over and over in conflict. And so that's where the Security Council resolution is very much at the top end of the scale, and making those Security Council resolutions work is really difficult, and it's very complicated. And there's often, you know, we're in a very cynical world, and people, oh, what's the point? It's just the Security Council do nothing. But the Security Council have a job to do. Whether we think they do it or not is a different conversation, but they have a job to do, and making sure that these type of actions that affect a family, it affects children's lives, making sure that those actions are brought to the attention of global leaders, but also that we, this community here this morning, but other people are also aware that this is still happening, and it's not something that was happening 50 years ago, it's happening today, you know. And so that's a big part of our work. I could, again, get into a lot more of the detail, but I'd be interested to just throw it out there and then see what questions come back. Yeah,
I think it's such a big issue that has really it causes really local problems, and it's so easy to say, oh, it's their problem, it's not ours, it doesn't really affect us, it's not on our doorstep. But as consumers in Ireland, we actually have quite a big role to play, and it's difficult to understand the power we hold as consumers. Lucy, I'm interested into delving a bit deeper into the power consumers actually have. And Peter mentioned the word justice. And as consumers, I think we can really help create justice for communities that we mightn't be exactly part of. So I'm interested to hear what you think from Fair Trade's angle.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's really interesting as well. I mean, I think it's funny because, you know, the past few years, I think, you know, sustainable fashion, for example, has become so popular, especially with young people. I feel like it's almost like embarrassing or really uncool to, you know, be buying fast fashion. It's been a fantastic movement, which is amazing. You know, things like, especially from Irish people, like Sustainable Fashion Dublin, I think they're the Useless Project now, and you know, Fashion Revolution, Who Made My Clothes, has been amazing and so successful. But for some reason, really unfortunately, I don't think we've kind of seen the same kind of journey with food. Like, who made my food? Where is this coming from? who's along the supply chain of this product, like cocoa, for example. It goes through so many different stages. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that, which is like really sad. And I don't really know why. It's funny because, you know, fashion, the best way to be sustainable is with, you know, just don't buy anything. Whereas food, it's a bit more difficult because, you know, we all have to eat something. And I think we are kind of seeing that a bit more. People are, you know, a bit more invested in being like fair and a bit more ethical. I think we're seeing a huge increase in the amount of people eating plant-based foods. Rachel being a great trendsetter there. And then, you know, a lot of people, especially recently, like the past few weeks, I think them Irish Times lists of, you know, sourcing Irish, which is fantastic. But I think there's a real disconnect when it's coming from people outside of Ireland. I think you don't think, how did this bowl of cereal get to me? How did this chocolate bar get to me? Which is really unfortunate. But I think, you know, we can all just make really small changes. Like, I'm not saying everyone should go out and buy, you know, everything local, organic, ethical, like, because it can be expensive, and I know that's not accessible for everyone. But if we all just start making smaller changes, you know, buying a fair trade coffee, buying, you know, local veg, like small things, it just becomes part of your habit. It just becomes the norm, and it's so easy to do once you do it. And I think it's just such an easy way to be, you know, a little bit more sustainable, more thoughtful, just do your bit for justice and equality.
I think you've touched on a really important local issue, a national issue. I know if I go onto my university campus and I have a non-reusable, non-compostable mug, like, no, banned from campus. It's shameful. You shouldn't do it. And we have a question from Sally Daly. Just to put it out there, we have this Padlet. There's a link to it from Leo in the chat box. So if people want to look at that and see what people are posting before the this session took place, please do. But she has just mentioned that there are a lot of images in the Padlet about plant-based diets, and as you've just mentioned, and she has said that they are good for the planet, but does this focus have its own problems in terms of who gets access to healthy food and why? And I think she's also touched on a very interesting topic, because we have seen the rise of plant-based diets, but sometimes a plant-based diet can be a luxury for people. Not only in Ireland, but in the global south, it's difficult, and healthy fruit and veg can often be more expensive than the fast food that is, for example, available on my campus. So I'm interested to hear from an inside perspective, maybe from Peter, about this topic.
So, Sophie, thanks. I mean, it is a really interesting analogy between where the plant-based and the organic piece is relative to where fair trade is and fair trade has been in the past. The truth is that when things start, there's always early adopters, and it's a small minority of people. And in the marketplace, when there isn't, or when there aren't, when most people aren't involved in something, then premiums get charged, and unreasonable premiums and unnecessary premiums. What we're seeing now with fair trade is that there's loads, most of the retailers are involved, most of the suppliers are involved in products like coffee, more are getting involved around cocoa. And you know, the more people get involved commercially means the cheaper, the better quality product can come to market at. But it's also the reason why we as citizens, and this thing about consumers, I kind of balk at the idea of us being consumers, because it involves some kind of passive people who sit here stuffing their faces with chocolate for breakfast every morning. We're not, we're activists. So it's like you said at the start, it's a political act. But it's not just us consuming that's political. It's a signal, it's a market signal back to the businesses. Oh, I'm going to buy this, I'm not going to buy that. It also allows us to engage in policy and advocacy work around the really substantive problems of child labour in cocoa. So the European Union is looking at bringing in legislation for the chocolate industry where 50% of chocolate is eaten. to try and deal with the fact that even today in 2020, there are 2 million estimated child labourers in the cocoa industry. Fair trade can't resolve these. We can't do it by eating chocolate, but we can send signals to people, and we can also lobby for different policy changes and work with the Irish government and through the Irish government with the European Union to affect much bigger change and to affect the work of the big multinationals who are involved in a lot of these supply chains. So I think it's early days, and I think for the plant-based stuff, for the organic, more natural, the less mass-produced. I mean, the truth is, there was an argument for cheap foods after the Second World War. The world needed to feed itself, but it was it just got out of control, and it developed into a way of working that did consolidate power and wealth in very few people's hands. We need to open that up again. But I think as more consumers get involved, hopefully it'll be more accessible, because the businesses will bring down the price. They won't be able to stick as high a margin on it as they might be currently.
There's just a comment from Louise in the chat box. She has said that there seems to be a lot of emphasis on the individual generally. Should more emphasis be put on changing the system? I love that question. I think that's a really, really interesting one. Rachel, do you want to take it?
Yes, and you're right, Louise. More emphasis should be put on the system, but the only way you move the system is by all the individuals using their power and demanding that the system be changed. Otherwise, the system continues comfortably because people aren't pushing back on it. So, I mean, that's just a very quick answer, I suppose. I think if we look at again, back to where we started on the system and which bit of this massive issue we want to capture, but I'm interested that we haven't touched on climate change in the conversation yet. And I think that's really key in terms of how the system is adapting, but also how, back to something Peter was saying earlier on, it's not just the kind of the demands from the global north, but there is a big responsibility on us, I think, in terms of the type of foods we like, the type of foods that generate the market, and then from where those, purchasing local, but for many of the things that we like and they're, the trends that go with it, whether it's quinoa or avocados or almonds or all the things that we like that are not necessarily good for the environment, to be produced en masse and to be flown halfway around the world. And I think those elements of the system that we also need to think about, that where market demand exists, then someone will find a way to respond to the demand. And often people don't really want to look at what cost. So the number of child laborers, for example, and the cost to land, the cost of massive tracts of land being bought in lots of countries, pushing small scale farmers off their land where they simply can't afford to compete. They can't afford not to sell their land. Their water systems being redirected, so people have less access to water to just water their crops and stuff. So from really from the very local impact and local when we look at ourselves, but also when we look at the demand for cut flowers and where they come from and the amount of water that those flowers take to grow in places like Kenya, for example, then what's the impact of all of that on the farmers, on the wider ecosystem in those areas? So the emphasis, the system is huge, and it really is which bit of the system can we tackle. But I think back to one of the points that was made earlier is that it's the consumers and the voters that push government in a certain direction. supporting organizations like Fairtrade, like Concern, who are pushing for policy change. The only way you can secure policy change if you have a critical mass of voices saying, really, this is just not acceptable and we don't want it. So I probably didn't answer your question in full, but the emphasis is on the system, but you have to bite off the bits of the system that you can change as you go.
Sophie, just on this and Louise's question about the system, I mean, I'm talking about power. Information really is power, and you know that's cliche. But here's something which I'm pretty sure people probably haven't thought about, because I hadn't thought about it enough. Well, I hadn't thought about it enough. The Irish government taxes chocolate in Ireland at about 20%. There's 20% VAT on chocolate. It's deemed to be a luxury product. So whilst a couple of million cocoa farmers in West Africa earn less than 90 cents a day, less than half the World Bank extreme poverty level, the Irish government, through its VAT policy, and it's not through badness, it's not that the Irish government also hasn't thought this through, we haven't thought it through, in terms of system change and policy change. And the work that Irish Aid does to support, NGOs do to support livelihoods in developing countries. Why are we taxing a commodity that is earning over 100 million a year for the Irish government from people who are living in abject poverty? So this isn't just about consumption, this is about getting information. So on our website, we produced a report this year called Craving a Change in Chocolate. And it looks at all of the kind of policy areas we need to address with the Irish government, with the European government, with the big multinational companies. There's staggering policy incoherences that exist. We do really good things in Ireland in terms of overseas development assistance. Irish Aid do really good things, the NGOs. But there are these blind spots, the things that we haven't informed ourselves about that need to change. And ideally need to change quickly, and could change very quickly, and could make a really big difference. If the 100 million that was going on VAT into the Irish economy, which is kind of like the old historical extraction, just extracting value from very poor people, if that was reinvested in diversification, in agronomy supports, in the work around gender empowerment, you could do a huge amount of work, vast amounts of work with it. So it's not just about consumption, it's about information, and then it's about change. What do we need to change to make things fairer, to empower people, and empower others who don't yet walk with enough of their own identity through the world.
I think what you touched on very briefly, and these are all really important, big issues that we're facing at the moment, but what you said was information fills in those blind spots, education fills in those blind spots that do exist. And I'm thinking of one such blind spot is that when we think of malnutrition, I know when I used to think of malnutrition, I used to think of that ads you'd see on TV of the starving children in Africa with their bones protruding and their bellies bloated from undernutrition. But when you become educated about malnutrition, malnutrition exists in many, many forms, and it is actually on Ireland's doorstep with the increasing rate of obesity, and that is actually a form of malnutrition. I'm just wondering if our panelists could touch briefly on the association of malnutrition with the global south, but how it exists on or in the global north, and how it is a rising issue and it's not really getting the attention it deserves. I don't know who wants to take it. It's a big one, sorry.
Shall I start? Yeah, I like that you said briefly, Sophie, thanks. So, okay. I think, and you touch on a good point, and we obviously in our sector, and certainly within Concern, we have a lot of conversations around the imagery that, like you said, the starving child and so on, and the imagery around that, and the whether it's a good thing to do or, to show, or a bad thing to show. And I actually watching what's happening in the UK in the last couple of days, where the aid budget has been cut and quite brutal choices being made and putting more money into defence and so on. And I do think that we if we don't see what hunger looks like, we look away. That's we look away. There's so many things that can take our attention. And I think back to the previous point you made about information and being informed. We have never had more information. It's everywhere. So there is a reason why we're not as informed as we should be, and it's because we're choosing different things. We can only absorb so much. These big conversations are complicated, and the question that we all come back to is like, well, what can I do? It's not much, and it isn't much, but it's the when you put all the little bits together that you have power, and you have people mobilizing and so on. In terms of malnutrition in the global north, and all this terminology sits very uncomfortably with me, because COVID has shone a different light on how people cope, and what different resources and resilience people have, and so on, and also how people respond to information and how they use it. But I think if we look at the work that Marcus Rashford has been doing in the UK, and his campaign to provide meals for children out of school, and you're looking at poverty and you're looking at hunger in one of the richest countries in the world, and the reactions to that, the public support for his empathy, using his life experience of being in school and getting a school meal, and then when you're out of school, you will be hungry, and actually remembering what's that like, and doing something about it. And I think that's where, certainly Ireland has that empathy with the world, because we've been there. The legacy of famine exists, and so on. I've kind of forgotten your question now, because I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent. Do you want to just remind me, so I don't keep yakking?
Yeah, it was just, I think you've covered it actually quite well in your tangent, because it was very, very interesting.
Sorry, okay, so I remember now. My point around malnutrition and obesity, and it is choices. And I think we touched on it earlier on, is that healthy food often costs money, and more money than people have, but also advertising, convenience. And if you look at the package of challenges that people have, and you look at the gendered challenges that people have, and it's very easy to generalize, but and maybe Marcus Rashford is a good example, where his mom worked 3 jobs to raise her boys by herself. She still lived in extreme poverty. She still struggled to feed her children. And so when you're struggling, you have all those pressures and so on, then how do you find the time to cook nutritiously when there's very easy options on the doorstep and so on? And then on the other side of it, it's not just about poverty, but a lot of it is about food ignorance that we have, and that's not related to food people, it's to poor people, it's related to choices. So the choices of eating fast food, the choices of eating unhealthy foods and so on, when maybe people simply don't know what the better choices are, or marketing, or there's a whole range of issues. I do think that undernutrition related to obesity is a problem, but there are systems in place to deal with that. So, and again, it's such a big issue, I don't want to get too stuck into it, so I'll just stop there. Sorry.
No, I think it's a really important issue, although it is a big issue. And again, what I feel like all our conversations are coming back to is the consumer and the power the consumer has, but also this sense of urgency, and we need more urgency around these issues. And I know we have very little time left, but I really want to touch on very briefly, Lucy, you mentioned you actually mentioned this acceleration of urgency earlier, and Rachel, you mentioned climate change and climate action, and what we've seen over the past year or a few years are young people taking to the street and demanding climate change and succeeding, which is incredible. How do you think we can get that sort of urgency around food system change and change in the food system? Is it about consumer power? Is it about local eating? What are the steps like the people listening here today can take, but also the general population? Let's finish on something positive.
I think it's kind of a complicated question because I don't think there's no one answer to solving everything. Unfortunately, life would be so much easier if it was. I think that, you know, in terms of like young people and trying to make a difference, and what you can do as an individual, I suppose, like what we do have the power and the changes that we can make is, I suppose it is as a consumer. I think that, yeah, sorry, I'm often forgetting your question.
What can we do?
You do, I mean, I suppose like from us, the actions that we ask people to take, what you can take is, you know, buy fair trade when you can. I suppose outside of that, buy local, like, you know, think about who is making my food when you're doing it and when you're doing your shop. I think it's such a small thing, but I think it's really powerful and effective. I think as well, you know, we said earlier on, you know, information is power. Tell your friends, tell your family, like be vocal about it. I think that makes such a difference and it just becomes second nature then as well, you know.
Peter, Rachel, any final words of action from you?
I think we live unfortunately in interesting times. It's the Chinese curse. But maybe we need it. Maybe humanity needs a kick in the arse to sort itself out. You know, more sustainably, less exploitatively, to extend the opportunities to more people. The fact that we're in crisis, food systems are in crisis, climate's in crisis. It's a motivation. It's a big motivation. Self-interest is probably the best motivator. People can no longer imagine that things are going to be okay unless we change things. And as we seek to address climate issues, then access to food, nutritious food and fair food chains, it all comes into play. So I think it's a really good time to be thinking about all of this, because system change is, for the first time maybe ever, it's not just do-gooders, it's not just people sitting around thinking, oh, it'd be nice if these things happened. This is actually the big time. All of these issues have moved from the margins to the mainstream. And we need to get involved in it, get involved, be active, join political parties, look at manifestos, look at actions and concern and fair trade. Become involved with Fair Trade Fortnight, work with Lucy in our youth campaigns, all kinds of things people can do.
And then maybe just to add to that, Sophie, I think absolutely be engaged, be informed, ask why all the time, ask why, not oh, there's a war there, you know, or there's another famine. You know, we're facing into multiple famines in the next year. You said at the beginning that we have a decade to the SDGs. I think one of the things that COVID-19 has done is made us really sit up and go, this lovely talk around the SDGs, and we are so far away from having systems that will protect people and support people when we have these huge shocks like COVID-19. The other interesting thing on COVID-19, and that's for another conversation, is that when the crisis affected us in our absolute everyday existence, the political wheels turned, and turned fast, in terms of releasing billions into propping up economies, in terms of helping people to survive, helping people to cope. And that level of political will and political engagement, even if we had a tiny percentage of that political will to try and change some of these big problems, it would make an enormous difference. And that's where I think, you know, having these kinds of conversations and people actually understanding the power that each of us has and translating that power into writing to your TD. And I know people go, oh, really, does it make a difference? But of course it makes a difference if everyone is doing it. If things are trending, or there's, you know, good Instagram conversations about things that people should be paying attention to, then all of that is really, really powerful. And maybe just the last thing is that, you know, policy change takes a very long time. And the members of the National Youth Council now are going to be the politicians in 10 years' time, and the leaders in 10 years' time, and building on that work, on what kind of planet we want to see in 10 years' time. It has to start now, because that change takes such a long time. So thanks for that.
No, I think really, really important. And there, it is these small actions. It is writing a letter to your TD. It is taking to the streets. It is about taking part in these discussions that we're having, whether it be in an informal session around the dinner table or the breakfast table, or on an Instagram post, or sharing something. No, nothing is too small. It really, really isn't. And you're not alone. And I know sitting at home now during COVID, it can be daunting and it can be a bit scary to take part in these sort of sessions or to share something. But knowing that you're not alone, and please, all young activists out there, really try and stay positive, because we are so close to creating big change. I just wanted to invite our graphic harvester, Maya, to show the work she captured during the session.
Hi guys, sure, I'm just in the middle of one right now, but I'll bring up something a little bit more finished for you, if I can find something for you to look at. So I think it's been a really interesting conversation. There's been lots about what the consumer can do and the power of the consumer, lots about how food is political and how it has always been political, but that is part of how we can enter into that political discussion. So it's been a really interesting conversation. Still working on a few images that will be sent out later, but hopefully captured some of the exciting things you guys have been talking about. So thank you.
They're really, really cool. I love them. I think infographics are such a really easy way to understand a complicated topic. So really amazing. Thank you so much. I wish I had your artistic ability. It's so cool. So I think on that note, I'll probably wrap up this session. Did the National Youth Council want to come in? I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, Peter, Rachel, and Lucy. I think you guys have motivated me a lot from having this conversation, because it can be, you can get a little bit down about these topics when you're sitting at home doing your own activism work. So to be reminded that people are working on them at such a huge scale, and that, you know, you're normal people. Fair trade and concern aren't ivory towers of work or developmental work. You know, you can get involved quite easily, actually. So thank you so much for sharing your insight and knowledge, and thank you everybody for showing up and for your questions and for taking part. I don't know if the National Youth Council wanted to come in.
Sophie, thank you so much for leading an incredible conversation this morning. An hour was never going to be enough to get through everything, and it's one of these topics of, once we start thinking about food, the global connections, yeah, as Rachel was saying, like, you go down tangents, you go down many different connections involved in living in our world today. To Peter and Lucy and Rachel, thank you so much for dropping some amazing knowledge on us, and to really lighten the fire in all of us. Christmas, of course, is a time of where people bring food, and food can play a big part around Christmas time. So is there the power of choice, the power of deciding what to buy? Can that play a role? Thank you all for this morning for joining us. There is more to come today. Later on this evening, our Young People's Committee will be taking over our YouTube channel, where we will be hearing from young people across Ireland, from Belarus, young people from the Lebanon, and also we'll be joined by the amazing and powerful Saoirse McHugh as well. So please check in on our YouTube channel at 6 p.m. And tomorrow we have our final Youth Summit happening tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. where we will be joined by the Migrant Rights Centre in Dublin, young people who will be telling their stories, their powerful stories of claiming and activating their power. So once again, thank you all very much, and stay safe, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.